Thank you for joining us, everyone. We'll begin in just a few moments. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's ASAP webinar, Leadership and Governance, Steps to Strengthening a Board for Change Management and USG Compliance. My name is Susan Melnick, and I'm the ASAP Communications Specialist, and I have some wonderful people with us today doing our presentation. Petronella Mwasandubi, who's the Capacity Advisor for Leadership and Governance with Global Communities, and Ebele Atshore, who is the Global Director of Capacity Development and Innovation with PACT. So they're going to be speaking with you today. Just a few things before we get started. Thank you so much for attending. I know many of you have been on our other webinars as well, and we're really, really thankful for USAID to allowing us to put all of this on. Today's Q&A is going to be done using the button that's at the bottom of your screen. Certainly you can use the chat to communicate with the panelists and with one another, but when it comes to questions, it's really helpful for us if you can put it in the Q&A box, and that'll allow us to go through all the questions. If any questions aren't answered, we'll go ahead and put together a document at the end of the webinar, and we'll have that available online within about a week. So all questions will get answered. We also have a poll that'll pop up in about the last 20 minutes or so of the webinar. And it's just for you to give your opinion about how it went, future topics, and overall your feeling about it. And today's presentation will be emailed to attendees, and it's also going to be saved on the ASAP website. So it takes us about 2 days to get it onto the website, and we'll have the slides available there as well. So you can refer back if there's anything that you missed, and then you can also view all of the other ASAP webinars that have been put online there as well. I think we're at about 43 webinars. Today will actually be our 44th, I believe. And we've had almost 9,000 attendees. So we thank you so much for coming. It's really been a joy for us to be able to put these on for you. And I'll go ahead and put this web address in the chat so that you can click on it at the end of the webinar. And this is where all of the webinars are listed. We do have some upcoming webinars already planned. So June 17th all the way to June 30th. We have quite a number through the summer as well. We're just fine-tuning the details on those. So please check back often and let us know if you'd like to be added to those as well. We're going to be sending out the invites very shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn over the screen and the mic to Ebele. Thank you so much. Ebele, would you like to share your screen?
Sure.
Perfect.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome again. And thank you so much, Susan, for that lovely introduction. We really appreciate your joining ASAP webinar today on leadership and governance, with a focus really on a discussion around strengthening local board. By the end of today's webinar, we are hoping that we would have gone through a quick overview of governance and leadership, shared some foundations for effective governance, discussed a little bit about expected oversight role of the board, and most interestingly, shared some link to some of the real life experience we've had so far with ASAP supporting local partners since its inception. We'll have a cross section of that, and that's really an exciting second part of today's meeting. So to get us started, really today's webinar is one in the series, as Susan has shared with us, of the many webinars that ASAP has been hosting on behalf of USAID to essentially support local partners so that they can get the needed resources to become stronger, better rooted, as well as ready to respond to the changes in the dynamic environments where they work. Before we jump into talking about governance and leadership, we wanted to start off by attempting to situate this in the context for which we are here today and for which this conversation is about. And so we wanted to start by putting out there the fact that non-governmental organizations or NGOs are usually, in wider term, applied to non-profit organizations, which just implies that it's independent of government. And NGOs are typically value-based organizations that depend largely on charitable donations and voluntary services. Although in the past couple of decades, as we all know, we have, as NGOs, we have become increasingly more professional. Over the last 2 decades or so, the principles of altruism and volunteerism still remain the real bedrock and the defining factor around how NGOs are formed. And so there are so many definitions out there of what NGOs are. For instance, the World Bank actually defines them as private organizations that pursue activities to relieve suffering, promote interests of the poor, protect the environment, provide basic social services, and undertake community development. But for today's purpose, it was important for us to share the fact that USAID does state that NGOs are critical change agents in promoting economic growth, human rights, and social progress, and that they work with both international and local organizations. And for the purposes of today's sharing, we're really focusing on local organizations and along with their networks in the countries, in the programs that they work in. And particularly, it's interesting to note that USAID is also interested in strengthening the local capacity of these CSOs that we work with at the country level, not just to deliver on the programming that they've asked them to deliver on, but also to achieve their own vision and mission. And the vision and the mission is something we're going to dwell a lot today on as we talk about governance and leadership. And so just to start on my left-hand side, there are 4 common themes that run through much of leadership theory. The first one is that leadership is a process. It takes time. It involves influence. Leadership occurs in a group context. There has to be a group for you to be leading. And that leadership involves the attainment of goals. So based on these analyses, leadership, simply defined, is the process whereby an individual influences a group to achieve a common goal. And governance, on the other hand, is the process by which the leadership of an organization makes decisions and takes actions to ensure that the organization conducts itself in accordance with its values, principles, and purpose. So governance means leadership, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. That's the way the King 3 report from Southern Africa simply puts it. So the question is, who governs? And for the purposes of this discussion, we're really thinking and focusing on the board of directors. And so who are they? So a board of directors is a group of external people, external to the organization, that work together to set strategic direction of the organization, for the organization, and they provide oversight and supervision. They ensure that the management and the operations are legal, that they are effective, and that they're efficient and also appropriate. Essentially, the board is the ultimately responsible for governing the organization and holds legal responsibility for the organization and all its processes. So what is the purpose of the board of directors? In real big, broad terms, to ensure the organization is pursuing its mission and achieving the nonprofit bottom line, and essentially to promote and protect the public, the donor and beneficiary interest. That's really, broadly speaking, what the board of directors is supposed to be set up to do in terms of its purpose. Now, different boards do it in different ways, and we have experienced quite a number of them in over a couple of years when we've all worked with NGOs and the boards. And so just to share a little bit about the principles of governance. Essentially, we like to group them because, to be honest, there are many principles, but really it's important that every board as a starting point needs to ensure that there are principles that they've incorporated that guide them and guide their operations. So there is the principle of accountability, and essentially just thinking about management needs to be accountable to the board. At the same time, the board also needs to be accountable to the beneficiaries and the stakeholders that they exist to serve as an organization, and overall accountability, including that of resources. And we'll spend quite some time today discussing these accountabilities in the next slides. And fairness, essentially, as the name implies, treat all stakeholders equitably, protect their rights, ensure actions if ever they are violated in any way. And then there is transparency, which we hear about all the time, which is really essentially referring to open leadership, timely and accurate disclosure of the situation, particularly the financial situation, and also the performance of the organization. Don't be shy to talk about where you are. Responsibility, and really responsibility is really just all about being on top of things, ensuring effectiveness and efficiency in the use of resources particularly. Overall, it's important to note that for a board to function efficiently, it needs to be able to function in the way, lead by example, so to say. And so a board's success really is dependent upon the board following some sort of code of standards that incorporates essentially the three fundamental fiduciary duties that include the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, the duty of obedience, according to the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. The board is the central decision-making body for the organization, and so it has the ultimate responsibility and accountability for the organization's actions. And the responsibilities of the board members are very, very numerous, and actually, to be honest, tedious, having been in one myself. But the good news is that it does pay off, and the payoff usually is priceless if you are doing a good job and if you have a great board and if you're doing the right things. And so let's talk a little bit about each one of these duties and what they really mean. The duty of care really just means that the board members actively are present. The board should exhibit the level of care by staying abreast of the organization's financial health. But I would like to say just the organization's health generally, whether it's the programs, whether it's accomplishments, whether it's what it's doing. The board should be that interested to stay abreast of every single one of these issues. And this requires that a director be informed and is able to exercise independent judgment that, you know, as can be demonstrated by the fact that they are very present and regular at meetings, at board meetings. They don't come only when it's convenient or when it makes sense. They actually prioritize it, keeping informed, asking questions, and exercising independent judgment when it comes to the matters that will be brought before them to discuss. And then the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty really is a standard of faithfulness to the organization. So the duty of it requires that the board members operate in the interest of the organization and not to use the position to further their own personal agenda. A great reason here for instituting the code of the conflict of interest policy, whenever we work with local boards or when we work with boards of directors, we always talk about that because it's quite easy for you to sit on a board and know that you know who can solve all the problems of the organization. And so it's important that you understand that part of the duty of loyalty is to be able to keep those parameters and keep those separations. So personal or constituent interests must be put aside all the time in favor of the decisions that is actually for the best interest of the organization and the vision and mission for which it stands or it is set up to achieve. And then duty of obedience. This is a very interesting one. Usually when I do board trainings and board development, I always start with asking the board the question around what is the mission for the organization? And it will amaze you at how many times and how often a lot of the board members are not quite sure of what that vision or what that mission of the organizations are. And it does trace back to how the board in the first place was instituted and why the members are participating, and if they even understand or know what the organization is set out to do even before becoming a member of the board or agreeing to become a member of the board. Talk a little bit about this when we talk about the qualities of an effective board. So really the duty of obedience requires that the board know the laws as well and the regulations that apply in that context. Board members should make sure that they understand the business of the organization, and they should be able to exhibit proper stewardship and governance of the organization's both legal and physical responsibilities around programs and services. So we, as you know, nonprofits rely heavily on the public's trust when soliciting for donations and grants. So the public does also have a right to know what it is you are actually doing and what you're utilizing, the resources that you're getting to do. So it's very important that the duty of obedience is taken very seriously by the members of the board of the organization. And so in spending a little bit of time to talk about the qualities of an effective board, because I think that in a lot of ways, this is one area where we end up, when we don't get it right, we end up having all sorts of challenges and problems, as we'll hear about later on with our board. And the first one is that the board needs to have clear mandates and roles. Actually, these are not organized in any particular order because I would have started with the fact that there needs to be a good orientation for the board members. It also needs to have clear, relevant bylaws. Again, the board needs to be able to exhibit and show and demonstrate that it understands what its role is, and in order to be able to actually govern the organization that it's set up to govern. So it also needs to be well-balanced, diverse board composition. And well-balanced and diverse in so many, it means so much, whether it's in the composition of its members, in the balancing of genders, or whether it's also in the composition of the different functional areas of the organization. If you have a board that is made up of people who are only understand the issues of finance, you will have problem in other areas of the organization. So you need to take a holistic view of an organization in the recruiting for the board to be sure that you've got people who have the expertise and the knowledge in the different areas and different components that the organization is to function, so that they can provide that oversight and guidance function. So strong board and executive relationship. We could talk about this for the next 3 hours. And you know, there's the good part of the strong board and executive relationship. There's also the not so good part of it. The relationship should be that is clearly demarcated by the roles and responsibilities of both the executive and the board, such that they don't go into encroach into one another's responsibilities, and also such that the executive isn't seeming to be in charge of the board, but that the board can actually operate independently so that they're able to work with the executive, as we will discuss later on. Effective decision-making processes. Again, another great area to live by example, to show the organization that you're governing, that you understand how to make decision. For every board meeting, you should have actionable items. And by the next time you come for another board meeting, you should be able to address where you are on each of those actions and take decisive decisions and show the processes that it's transparent and that you are accountable for what the decisions that you have made. They need to be effective fundraisers. One of the main reasons, especially the local NGO boards, why we end up recruiting some certain members to our board is actually because we think that they are influential. We think that they have the clout to be able to reach or get us to the right places. And so fundraising needs to also be guided, because you also don't want to go and commit the organization into places where it would ordinarily not go, because it does not support it's not ethical, or it does not support its mission. And the board also, for it to be effective, it also needs to have strong financial management. The board on itself needs to show that, demonstrate that, because if they can't demonstrate it, then there is really not very much guarantee that they're going to be able to govern an organization that needs to do that. And I think one of the very common, simple, and easily overlooked quality actually is an effective board meeting. And in my almost 20 years of working in the NGO sector, and really just being very passionate about local organizations and localization, and just really moving to the next level from where you are. One of the very interesting, simple things that I have encountered is just boards not being able to meet effectively. And there are so many reasons, that are so many different sides to it. It could be that you have a dominant chair who just brings the board together and just sits there and tells everyone what there is to be told, and that's the end of the meeting. And that completely just defeats the whole purpose of bringing this well-balanced and diverse board in terms of composition, because then you don't get the views and you don't get all that you wanted by going out to recruit a balanced board. So it's important. That's one way. I mean, there are so many other things that boards do. You don't also just decide that you're going to meet tomorrow and expect that everybody would drop everything they are doing. There has to be a system. You have to be you have to have your own bylaws that guides the board, and this should all include all these different things, including the meetings, its frequency, including agenda, including who should be there and what they should be there to do. And division of roles and responsibilities. Later on, I will share a couple of samples of some of the subcommittees that you could potentially include in your board. And then above all things, to be honest, is a rapport among board members. I met a very interesting board one time where, to be honest, the real challenge with that board was that they couldn't stand each other, you know, and this usually happens when boards overstep, when boards members, some feel more, you know, more connected to the organization than the other, and they can't even together as a board sit together and have one voice and have meetings, have agreements, actions, and move it forward, because there are people who just can't necessarily see eye to eye with the other people. And it doesn't mean that it started that way. Sometimes, you know, you are all great, you are recruited, you agree to work together, but somewhere along the line, something happens and things go sour. So it's very important that the board of directors think about how to resolve their challenges as quickly as possible, so that that does not get in the way of their role and the job that they have to perform. And so next, let me delve a little bit into the overarching functions of the board. And these include In the area of governance, the board is mandated and needs to function around providing the oversight, reviewing, evaluating, monitoring the organization and what's going on, as well as leadership. So, and leadership, is important for me to point out that this needs to be done in partnership with the executive director or the leadership of the organization. It's essentially to guide the mission and the direction, and also to ensure that dedication to and use of assets to benefit the public for which the organization is set up to serve. And then there's the legal oversight, very critical one, because could easily, lack of it could easily land the organization in trouble, and by extension, the board members as well. So ensuring that the organization is complying with all the legal obligations, which just tells you that you need to understand what those legal obligations are. So you need to, as a board member, you need to know enough about the laws that guide the NGO governance within the context and the country where you are, so that you can quickly step in to provide support. Or even, you don't have to know it all also. You could also be about providing referral. And then there is operational oversight, which we use to really cover a lot of things, but essentially just ensuring that the organization's work is getting done in an efficient and effective manner, and that ensuring that work is just also being done ethically, legally, and the right results are being gotten out of it, and always thinking about the beneficiaries for which the organization is set to target. So in more specific terms, it is the duty of the board to ensure that the organization has clear mission and purpose, that it has legal and ethical integrity and maintains accountability, adequate resources, effective organizational planning. It's important that part of the board understand that part of its role is to actually enhance public standing, to select the chief executive or to recruit the chief executive, because maybe sometimes when we say select, you think it's to pick, but actually it's to recruit the chief executive. So, and also to not just recruit them, but also be willing to support them, right? To being that you understand the vision, the strategy, the direction of this organization, it is the role of the board to provide that backbone and the support for the chief executive. And you do that also by making sure that there is standards for assessing their performance, and that is done. That was one of the very interesting things that I also have come across, is that a lot of times the board don't even understand this particular role. And so they never really assess the performance of the chief executive until someone from external comes to ask about it. Also, to provide proper financial oversight, this cannot be overstated, because I mean, if the organization does not have good financial standing, the chances of continuity is very limited. And recruit board members. Again, this is a function of the board, and the board needs to understand that if you lose a member or a member goes away, it's important that there's a process, a predetermined process for how you get in new members, and also it's important that there's at least a very effective system put in place to assess your own performance as the board, which you should be able to do annually. Because again, you remember that the staff in the organization are carrying out their annual performance assessment. So as a board, you also want to know how you did this year, what you set out to achieve, how much of it you were able to achieve, and why you didn't achieve them, and what else do you need to do, so that you can provide that bigger guidance. And of course, determine, monitor, and strengthen programs and services within the organization. And just in case you were wondering, what about the management? I just wanted to share some specific, clear differences between what it is the board is supposed to do versus what it is the management is supposed to do. And I know that this is one of those areas that we struggle where, because sometimes the management blurs in to the board, and then we're not quite sure of who's supposed to do what. So it's important that you're able to differentiate as a board and as the management of the organization who should be leading in which areas. And so, for instance, the organization's vision and mission, the setting of the direction, the approval of strategic plans and business plans, the review and approval of policies that are developed by management, the recruitment, evaluation, and release, if necessary, of the CEO. Because remember, the CEO is the highest person in the organization, so there really isn't anyone else to release them or to assess them, but the board, who is the governing body over the organization. Provide financial oversight, review and approve budget, lead in fundraising, as we've discussed before, and of course represents the organization publicly. I usually would spend quite a lot of time actually discussing the leading in fundraising, because we do find that a lot of times we do get the right people on the board, but these right people are not necessarily the ones that have the right skills for resource mobilization. And I want to just share that it's okay for the board and the management to reach out and find who can provide the board with those adequate skills, strengthen their capacity to be able to actually resource mobilize. Because as a board, you should really be thinking of the long-term sustainability for the organization. And so on the other hand of the management, really dissemination of the vision and mission is your role. Not that you haven't contributed to it, but you don't hold the final decision-making role for the vision and the mission. But you definitely hold the role to understand it, to internalize it, to disseminate it, and of course to implement it in the work that you do. And of course, the strategic plan that is approved by the board needs to be developed by the management, as well as the business plan, right? Because the management understands what the day-to-day running of the program is, and they understand the different thematic areas and objectives and goals that needs to be covered in the strategic plan. Develop work plans, of course, based out of the strategic plan, because strategic plans are usually for the longer term, maybe 3, maybe 5 years, but the work plans or operational plans in this case could be for the year. And of course, you could also have those ones for projects as well. Then development of the policies and manuals, for the board's consideration and approval. When we're talking about the qualities of an effective board, one of the challenges that I've encountered is where you have so many policies already developed by the management and moved onto the board, but then they are sitting there because the board has just not had time. They've forgotten that they have those 3 duties of care, of loyalty, and obedience that is supposed to be ethically binding, which means that they also need to spend some time, carve out the time to review these policies and these manuals and be able to provide the approval needed. Or maybe it's not an approval, maybe it's not well done. That's also great. Provide the direction, provide feedback to the management to go back and do some more work on them, because those policies are very, very important and necessary for them to do the work that they have been set up to do. Provide board with financial reports, develop budget. Just to spend a little bit of time on this idea of provision of financial oversight. I once encountered an organization where the board's subcommittee for finance would actually come to the organization and perform their own internal audit before the external auditor who was paid would come in. And it was very helpful for the organization, because even before an external person showed them the gaps, they had already had the opportunity of learning and seeing that these gaps were being addressed. And so it's important that you have a board that is financially aware and understands enough to know when to ask questions. Assist in fundraising. So the fact that your management does not mean that you don't have any business with fundraising, but also maybe your focus might be to develop this plan, this resource mobilization plan, and be able to engage with the board on how best for you to utilize it. And also, of course, as well, represent the organization publicly. So representation for the organization is very critical because it's a role for everyone who has the interest of the organization as at heart. And so, like I shared earlier, would want to spend a few minutes to just share some sample, depending on the size of the board, depending on the size of the organization, then you determine what are the critical subcommittees that we could institute or that we need for the effective and efficient running of this board. So examples is always the finance, the audit committee is always very critical. And then you have the programs one as well. Not everyone is very is interested in numbers. So at the same time, not also everyone is very interested in program. And if you have recruited a well-balanced board, you should have people that have interest and expertise in these different areas to be able to lead and manage the subcommittees that could help the organization to look into those different areas. I didn't want to finish without sharing that there is also the space and the opportunity for ad hoc committees, which usually are those formed quickly once there is a specific need, once it arises. And a great example is, we've lost the CEO, we need to recruit one quickly, but we don't necessarily need to have the whole board come and be engaged and spend the time in the process, but we want to have this group of people subcommittee to lead the process and provide us with feedback on how it's going, and then draw on what needed support that they may require from the larger board. And of course, it could also be that there's a fundraising event and that the board wants to be able to be part of it, and maybe everybody can't be part of it. So it's important that you think about those subs so that the board members do not get overwhelmed, because remember also, the board members usually all have other jobs, that their own day job, right? They've just been recruited to serve a role for this organization. So it's important that you recognize that, so that no one is ever overwhelmed and everybody is able to address the other needs that they have. So just wanted to spend a little time, and really just drill down a bit on this side of board oversight, the expected oversight from the board, because this webinar is hosted on behalf of USAID, and it is as a result of the fact that the ASAP project, saw the need to discuss and share a little bit more about how to strengthen boards. And so we did want to drill down a little bit around the board oversight, because ensuring that the organization is financially sound and well managed is one of the most important duties of the board, of roles of the board. And it has such a huge ripple effect that it's important that we, talk about it. And I really just want to hone in on two specific things, but just to share that the board needs to ensure that the organization has sufficient resources to fulfill its mission. We spent a lot of time talking about fundraising, and that at all times, the board should be aware of the general financial condition of the organization. And if you're a member of the board today and you're listening, and I'm asking you, what is the financial condition of that organization that you are part of their board, I would like to hope that you are aware of what that is. And if you are not, that maybe after today's webinar, you will go and ask some questions to understand how they're doing, so that you're also not taking unawares, so that, because sometimes we only find out the financial situation when the organization goes bankrupt. And so just to talk a little bit about establishing internal controls. So it is the duty of the board to ensure that internal controls are both established and implemented. Internal controls really promote both integrity and efficiency. When they're in place, as explicit board policy, internal controls reassure donors like USAID, like World Bank, like Global Fund, and also your constituents, right? The beneficiaries that you serve, that the organization's resources are used well and wisely. When they have those, when they see that you have those internal controls. And I think, just to stop a moment here and say that I know when a USAID sends out calls for proposals, part of what you submit, not just them, everybody really, donors really require that you share some of these policies to help them review, to see that when you say you will do something around internal controls, that you actually have a policy that ensures that you actually do it. So among most of the important internal controls the board can introduce real quickly is definitely the professional accounting standards or separation of transactional responsibilities, sound investment policies, and of course, annual audits. Annual audits, regardless of how small the organization is, it would be good for you to have some level of way of checking how the organization is doing financially annually for the organization's health. And then credibility and accountability. Accountability is about efficient and effective delivery of services, really. So the organization must have the system and the policies in place and the procedures, on how to ensure that there's an effective management of the funds, the resources that it has. As we all know, we're in a place where there is the dwindling funding sources. So it's important that whatever it is you get as an organization, that you do have that credibility and accountability around making sure that it's effectively managed. And it's part of the role of the board to make sure that this is happening through their oversight function that they provide for the organization. Effectively manage and deliver services, don't just think of the programs of the organization as in have they done it, but you should also understand what is the scope of it, right? Understand what is in this award document that this our organization has received. What are the parameters guiding it? Are we able to deliver on all the different things that the donor is requiring? What are the donor requirements? Are we doing that? So then should be able to monitor performance in meeting all the stated goals and objectives. So this also says that you're watching out to make sure that there is no commingling of fund, any kind of misuse, any kind, you're ensuring that that which you have said you are going to do with the resources that you wrote for is exactly what your organization is doing with it. And of course, demonstrate the outcomes of these fundings, right? I always find it gladdens my heart when I meet a board who can talk about the results that the organization that they are working with is producing. And it doesn't mean that they are there in the day-to-day management of the organization. It just means that they are interested enough. It just means that they are invested in this organization enough to know, to ask questions, to read documents, to follow up, and understand how the organization is doing, and follow up on, on requests. This quarter's board meeting, the CEO shared that they had submitted a number of proposals, right? And the next quarter's board meeting, did we actually follow up to see, have we made any headways? What's going on with the financial situation of the organization? Is there anything that you need support from the board to do? Of course, to conduct evaluation and report to donors if you find anything that is fishy as an organization. That is part of being transparent ahead of time. And so in conclusion, if you have not picked up on anything I have said in the past couple of minutes, I want to ask that you remember these 4 things: that in order for an organization to be well governed, it needs to be able to use the board as a source of innovation and also a conduit for new ideas. So the board is not, the board is also being creative and innovative. And also we can rub minds with the board. We can go to the board and present what we are thinking as management, and expect that the board will give us the adequate requisite feedback. And so that just tells me also that when you're in a board meeting, you're present, because the whole of you needs to be there to be able to provide, to engage and provide support. Also, secondly, has greater resilience in times of crisis or change. If we haven't learned anything, the past year plus, almost a year and a half, should have taught us that resilience is a prerequisite for every organization. So it's important that we think about the fact that a well-governed organization needs to have greater resilience in times of crisis and change. Be ready to be agile, to be adaptive to the environment. Also, it has greater potential to positively impact the lives of those that they serve. Again, a well-governed organization would be very strong. They go forward knowing and understanding who they are and knowing that the board has their back as they do the work that they do. And ultimately, it just has greater legitimacy around the work that they do, because everybody understands who they are. Everybody knows that they have the right systems in place and that they are being governed appropriately. So with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Petronella, to provide us with this link to real life practice. Petronella.
Thank you very much, Ebele. This was really wonderful. Good afternoon, good morning, nearly good evening to you all. We've had a brilliant session from Ebele. So now I am going to be talking to you about what we've been doing. But before I do that, I just want to introduce myself. So I'm Petronella Mwasandube, and I'm Capacity Advisor for Leadership and Governance within ASAP, but I'm working with global communities. So I am going to be sharing with you, our ASAP Leadership and Governance capacity strengthening that we've actually been doing with the local partners in the sub-Sahara countries. And within that is really sharing our approach. So most of the things that Ebele has actually shared is very much about that. Next slide, please, Ebele. Thank you. And also what I will be doing within this is to highlight, the appreciative inquiry process that we've been using. And what do I mean by this? It's really using an approach as capacity advisors at ASAP, whereby we want to inspire, we want to energize, we don't want to demoralize the local partners that we're working with. So within leadership and governance alone in their organizations, they've got some tough jobs they are working to. And therefore our approach is very much building on where they're at and where they desire to be. So very much appreciative inquiry process within that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you through some challenges, areas that we have faced and talk about how we dealt with it. And I will focus on these three areas: the board role and strategy. Ebele has talked about what that means in terms of the strategic plan, but I'm going to bring you a bit closer to the people in terms of, articulating what the challenges are that they're experiencing, and maybe one or two examples of how, we've been supporting them to actually move forward with some concrete, good strategic intent, focus, and outcomes from them. And then looking also at oversight role of the board and leadership and the advisory role of the board to management. Next slide, please. As we've heard from the last session, the way I sum up leadership and governance is very much about how the board and strategic leaders, our executives, set the tone in the organization. But before I share the challenges, I think we need to appreciate them because they are really, really, it's good news. The organization we're working with in ASAP, they are boards that are comprised of hardworking leadership, multitasking, inspirational leaders. They are boards that work in alignment with the executive leadership. And what do I mean by that? Is that just that they understand each other's roles. They realize that in order to move the ship along, they've got to complement each other. So there's what the executive leaders does, as we heard from the other slides with the Abele, but also what the expectation of the board towards leadership is, and that alignment is happening. And then, we have to appreciate that our NGOs work in some of the poorest places of the world, and that, they're having to work innovatively, thinking outside the box to secure funding and managing really large, complex projects. And they are making an impact within that. Next slide, please. So overall, talking about the leadership and governing boards, what we found is that some boards are not actually fully functional. They lack the effectiveness that has been talked about earlier on. In particular, we're talking about, some boards have not got a balanced board. They have not got the right level of people with the right skill set to advise them on audit, financing, and maybe just human resources in some of those areas of fundraising. And then, of course, that all ultimate mandate, the board charter, is not often used adequately as a point of reference. So they may well have the charter, but actually it's not been updated, it's on a shelf somewhere, and actually, when it comes to decision-making processes, it may not even be followed as outlined in the board charter. So this has been really an opportunity for us to motivate, to bring back the board charters live. And then, we found in some of the organizations that there is this, what we call the founder syndrome, which, it's great. They are the people who've been in the organization from the beginning, but usually it tends to mar some of their, effectiveness in terms of a board with new people coming in and maybe continuing for too long. And therefore that whole strategic direction gets, lost along the lines. So the other last one would be, I'll be talking again about within that founder syndrome, they may well handpick people who they know, but those people may not be as effective for them as a board. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Firstly, one of the things we've done as ASAP Capacity Advisors in Leadership is to really introduce a robust training program for board directors, but we also invite the top leadership of the NGOs that we work with. And that is really key because then you're already bringing them together. It opens up some dialogue, some opportunities to have that aha moment with regards to some of the, the way the dynamics are working in the organization. And within that, we then follow through after training with coaching, depending on where the organization is at. And that is really key to that. We've also been working with them, obviously, using a collaborative approach. And I often push for that very much so, getting the buy-in from the executive leadership. Because once they've had their NUPAS Plus assessments, and then we are coming in with a whole list, which looks like a shopping list of issues that they've got to address. Myself as a capacity advisor in leadership, one of the main things that I would be wanting to do is to use an emotional intelligence approach to making sure that there's buy-in from the leadership. We're here not to threaten them. We want to support them. And then we start to support them with their improvement action plans, having regular meetings, just so we take them through what is expected of them. Next slide. And then when I look at the board's role in strategy, what we found was that some NGOs lack a clear strategy roadmap. Where are we? Where are we going? How are we going to go? They may have a strategic plan, but actually they don't get to discuss it at various points within, in a year, perhaps. And that sometimes the strategic plan does not even seem to be fit for purpose. There's been examples of NGOs that just, they obviously have a parent organization. They've developed a strategic plan, but they don't actually tend to then, develop it, adopt it to the local context. And these are the areas that we also start then to support them through that. And then there's this all important having board members who may be there and causing problems for the executive and the board because they are conflicting agendas about the future of the organization. And usually that tends to happen where the board does not often make time to really engage with each other, engage with their executives to see what's going on, and really keep checking on whether the strategy that they have is still relevant at that time. Next, please. So what we did is very much clarifying the board's role. As we saw, there's clear demarcations, what is expected of the board. And one of the key things is that they are the custodian of that strategic plan. So we work with our boards on sensitizing them on the issues to do with their role within strategy. And I always try to encourage that it's not about the minutiae, seeing how the executive leadership are managing and working with their teams, on a day-to-day things, but more at a big picture level, but very much linked to performance management. Are things happening as they should be? Do we like what we see? Are the outcomes that, that we have in line with what our stakeholders' expectations are? So really getting them to understand some of those questions. And I usually have a lot of questions that they can take away and start to ask themselves on that. And within that strategic alignment, the collaboration between the board and the top leadership is pretty key. So we try to promote joint up thinking, joint up working, but also whilst ensuring that each one understands their role. This role is going to be one of trust. The role where someone, the board also puts themselves in the position of the executive leadership. So empathy comes into it very much so. And then as the last point is, where we have really supported the executive leadership to actually look and take a fresh look at where they're at themselves. And this is where we have, as capacity advisors, regular meetings with them, talking about the activities that they are supposed to be working on, being there as a solution for them, sharing some of the tools that we have, so that it's a safe landing place for the executive. And then as they go to work with the board, then it's there's that joined up thinking, and that they are all feeling enabled to move on collaboratively. Next one, please. And then when we look at the the board's overall role of oversight, what we found was the weak finance management and risk management systems in the organizations. In this also, the board not getting disclosures on risks facing the NGO from management. So there's this there's a disconnect, basically lack of communication about what are the risks we're facing. And therefore the board not being aware of that, because people don't often share that at a high level. This is where we then come in and say, during our training and coaching, how are you discussing some of the risks at a high level with the board? Is this an agenda item, or is it something that only gets discussed if there's been a real big issue in the organization? And what we promote here is proactivity. So therefore, training on risk and developing, the risk management tools for them pretty comes in on there, because again, no training on risk means that actually, the oversight role is not as it should be. And within that, one of the things that we found was very much lack of escalation of fundamental finance or risk issues. Again, it talks to the 2 points I've just talked about, whereby if you do not have the system in place, then the boards and or the executives, there's no way of both parties actually understanding who is in charge in terms of when is it that we should escalate and involve the board, and also how does that get dealt with, and who then is the risk owner who reports, and making sure that we are keeping on top of those issues. Next slide, please. So what we brought here is very much clearly the first bit is an understanding of the board's role in having enough visibility into the operations of the NGO, the organization, but not interfering, like I say, not dealing with the minutiae, but enough visibility framework. We often share a framework that says here's the governance areas, here's the risk areas, here it's the culture, and looking at how the strategy is going and leaving the rest to the executive leadership themselves. And by so doing, we created opportunities to really openly discuss the oversight of senior management's collective ownership and individual accountability for compliance, which I know Ebele talked a lot about, regulation, risk management, and fraud. And of course, the all-important internal control systems that mitigate risks. So we share this wonderful risk management tool where they can really follow the process and actually start to be very aware of what their risks are. This is the risk appetite and how in danger they are, and which of those risks they should be escalating at what time, and to the board. So both parties are playing together, and the importance very much of also a system of checks and balances that brings in accountability and transparency is one of those that we also then linked into internal control systems. We encourage that. What do I mean by this? So for instance, if there's a decision by the executive leadership that they need to, a big purchase needs to happen, this involves a lot of resources. So who authorizes it? Who signs the check? Procurement processes, and who then checks that actually this is all transparent. It's really getting them to really focus on those important elements of risk management and ensuring that they are very effective. Next one, please. And then when we started to look at the board's advisory role to management, we found some boards were not supporting the CEO. Examples of chief executives who do not talk very well with the boards, or the boards are not really linked in with the chief exec. They only meet 3 monthly meetings, if that. So there is no continuity. So there is no information sharing. And so we started to give examples of, how we can improve that. Clearly, a disconnect existed in some of the boards with their chief executive, again, with regards to what I've just talked about. And also, that also talks to maybe not the board not actually having the quality board members recruited in the organization as well. Next slide, please. And so what we did is to enhance the advisory role by focusing them on the key areas of accountability. So there's this decision-making authority, very much organizing the organization on who is responsible for making decisions and which ones, again, like I mentioned earlier, need to be escalated and at what stage. Is this just for senior management? Is it for the executive? And as the executive then, takes that to the board. And then also looking at the organizational structures that then define and clarify responsibilities for operational and, looking at the chain of command in the organization, that there's clarity between the executive leadership, top leadership, and the board, in terms of who makes the decision and how they are escalated as well. And then looking at the organizational design that should be understood by all parties, the top leadership, managers, and all the employees and stakeholders. And it sends a message that obviously the NGO is managed in the best interest of the stakeholders as well. So this also talks to having clear lines of who is accountable for what and what is the board responsible for. And everybody is very clear in terms of advising the management, working together, but very much on a collaborative way, in the organization. Next slide, please. So we've been coaching the board and having time out to just, supporting them. And I hasten to add, it's not just, us just giving them information, but it's more collaborative support, coaching them on the areas that are of concern to them, getting them to take obviously their advisory role with regards to the executive leadership as well. And then also promoting and advising the boards to really look at having board skills matrices. One of the tools that we've developed in ASAP and board evaluation tools. And what that does is it allows them to bring in the expertise that they need. So for instance, the financial accounting with regards to the oversight roles, some people who will just make sure that they're able to sleep at night because they know they've got people who will ask the right questions about budgets, about whether the organization is spending the money well, or whether, are they likely to run out of money. So that expertise to be able to assist the other board, but also bringing in, so for instance, some of our local partners are bringing in people with, development experiences, because is got chief of parties who are running huge projects. And therefore that also allows the board, that discussion on feedback, outcomes that are happening with the project delivery, and it supports the boards themselves very much so. And then of course, encouragement of that the new members that they bring in, that they have an induction and that they're mentored through the system, so that engagement really comes in right from the outset and they hit the ground running with regards to supporting other members and the board within their role. And this is where also they may well be, inducted into the committees that they will be overseeing. And there's often a problem in that some people tend to think the committees now belong to the organization, to the top leadership. But in actual fact, yes, the executive leaders sit on those committees, whether it be finance committee or audit committee or HR. But then any issues that are discussed and agreed on and voted on by the members, they've got to be reported up to the board, and then the board has the final say. So having those systems in place and mentoring them through that is what we have been doing, really. Next one, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So I've just in the last few minutes covered some of the areas we've advised our governance board and leadership, for effectiveness and efficiency. And I always use this word, a fresh approach. Usually the style we like to bring in is that we want them to work with, we're not saying change who you are, but sometimes it's about, have you thought about something this way? So you will find on this sort of, diagrams on these slides, I'll talk to each one of those. I mentioned emotional intelligence at the beginning. This is very key, is capacity advisors in leadership and governance, because we expect our leaders, our executive top leaders, our board leaders, and ourselves to deal with, to use emotional intelligence in what we do. So one of the things that, I certainly have brought in when we're talking to our boards is to get them to think of a compass game. This is a north, east, south, west, and that each one of us, we belong in this group. And what that does is that as a board, you don't want people who are north, the people who come in and say, let's do it. They like to act, they like to do things, they like to jump in. And then there's the east, the speculators. These guys, like to look at the big picture and the possibilities before acting. And then we have the south, the caring people who say, no, Petronella, we can't wait. You know, I know we're running 30 minutes late, but let's wait for, you know, someone else because we want their contribution. And then the last one is the West, paying attention to detail. They like to know the who, what, when, where, and why. This is where I say, you know, these are the people who really have to understand everything before making decisions. What I'm saying here is we try to promote our boards and leadership to actually look at something like this and say, okay, are we currently all North, or have we got too many East, and therefore who else do we need to bring? So while they look at the expertise and knowledge, they also look at the characteristics of the individuals they want to bring in. And then, of course, you know, keeping them on tab with their strategic plan, always reviewing the current state and looking at the enablers. So we help them with their strategic approach, those enablers to keep looking at the future, removing the pain points, but getting them to bridge the gaps from where they are to where they're going. And then in order to do that, it's about them always, you know, watering themselves. This is, you know, how, you know, regular training, joined up training of the board and the management, board training, mentoring sessions, so that they keep on top of the game with regards to where they are. And then on the far corner, one of the things that I think as boards, and we are promoting very much so, is that they are be aware of the, you know, the dysfunctions of the board. You know, so there's trust, there's conflict, there is lack of commitment, inattention to results, and looking at all those key and dealing with conflict and looking at them at all those things and saying, so where are we at? And which one is it that is really a pain point for us? And encouraging them to really deal with it in a, you know, cohesive and sort of engaging way with themselves. And then when I look, you know, the succession planning, one of the policies, I know Ebele talked a lot about some of the, you know, the issue of policies, and sometimes there's an overwhelming amount of policies, but one of those we encourage is obviously succession planning policy being effective, and that the organization is always looking ahead at the skills. Do we have the right people in the right place, doing the right job at the right time? But who else do we need to bring in? Our agenda is changing. So a succession planning policy always in place is something really we expect effective teams to be looking at. The last three I've already talked to, so this is just reminding us that these systems of checks and balances, very key to capacity strengthening of boards and their leadership, and that you should always shining the torch on key areas of finance, risk, fraud, and whether you've got the right level skill set in the organization, checking on some of these areas, keeping everybody on top, and that accountability is there, and that there's transparency as the principle of the board. And of course, that risk management is happening all the way. So just some examples there. And the next slide, please, Abel. I think that's all really. So I hope in the last few minutes, I've just taken you through some of what we are doing as capacity advisors in leadership and governance. But one thing that I would add to that is that even though I am focused and the teams that we work with, we are on leadership and governance, we also work with the other capacity advisors who have got this special knowledge in gender, you know, looking at who the, you know, the board mix within the organizations, within the boards themselves, and they also then develop the policies for us and work with each other as a team. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So we have quite a number of questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and read a question out, and then among the two of you, if you don't mind deciding which of you will answer it, maybe you both can. So let's see here. So one of the questions that repeated itself is, what is the best number or the frequency of board meetings? How often should boards meet to be most efficient?
So, okay, I'm going to come back on camera. Thank you so much for that question. That's always a very exciting question, and we get that quite often. So, frequency of meetings for boards to actually be effective. I would say that it does depend on the size of the organization, the size of the board, but I would target to have a quarterly meeting so that you are able to check in on progress made on the work that the different work streams that you've started. So I would say frequency was one question, Susan. And what was the other one? Number of the board?
No, the question was the frequency of the board meetings. And then the other one was how to have an efficient board meeting. What are the things that should be brought up? What are the topics that are most important in any board meeting?
Okay, so let me take a stab, Petronella, and then I'll hand it over to you because you could probably speak from the experience of the partners that you've met so far. So first of all, for an effective board meeting, please have an agenda ahead of time. It's very important that the board members who are coming are clear on what it is they are coming to do. In well-developed organizations, it's not just only an agenda, it's an agenda with all the supporting documents around the different agenda items that will be discussed so that the board members have the time to prepare, to read up, to understand, and really literally come with questions. Like I mentioned, board members themselves have their day job. So you want to make sure that you're providing them with enough information and resources to help make their job easier in the time when they are actually physically present to address issues in the board. So I would say have a clear agenda, with that would identify who's doing what, when, how, and I think I think you're set to go in terms of what you need. Okay. But I'll hand it over to Petronella.
Thank you, Abel. I think it's a very good question because when it comes to board meetings, it's really, we take a step back from the date. So quarterly is good, but also as you get to that date, it's about ensuring that the board is sharing the documents in advance and that there's, the executive and the chair and the board agenda is such that it's going to be effective. And I think those three areas we talked about a lot on overall, strategy, oversight, and just, the day-to-day operations, that they're key high-level, agenda items that, there's some that are always, repeating. So risk should be one of those, but also issues on conflict of interest where the board sets itself to ensure that if they're important items they're going to discuss, then members should be aware that they may need to declare depending on what they're going to be discussing and the outcomes, and or if there's any personal interest that might come into that. And if it is finance department, a good meeting is that the board should be given enough information to understand, again, talking about whether they've got enough money in the kitty and whether they've got enough to move on, and that actually when the presentation is being done, they are able to work through their agenda effectively. And then the last one I would mention now is also that they've got sufficient numbers of board members to the quorum is so that they can have good deliberations in that board meeting. Otherwise, that would be not effective at all. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Perfect, that's wonderful. So one of the questions that we have is, what do you do when a board, members of the board have been headhunted by the founder? And what type of legal requirements are out there to help them, to help people keep that from happening? Or once it's happened, what do you do?
Yes, now that's a tricky one, I guess. I guess we start by saying we need, probably you'd want it, in harmony in here. This is where I think, we are working with boards to try and highlight some of the, the dynamics and understand that. And, I've certainly come across, worked with boards where you realize that actually the founders are part of the main system. And even in the subtle way we are introducing this is to sort of say, maybe you might want to look at the dynamics of the board that there is transparency. And once that headhunted individual is part of the board, then the board chair needs to set the tone in terms of the objectivity and the way they manage the board themselves. And this also talks to the issue I touched on very briefly, where most of these boards, what is really great is about using the board evaluation tools. And this tool is evaluating the chair, the board members individually, and also evaluating themselves collectively. So they need those opportunities to be actually looking back and getting that feedback and then discussing the issues collectively and not targeting the founder member. But I can well understand that it's a very, very sensitive one as well. I don't know if Abel would like to jump in on that as well.
I mean, just to add that, I mean, if this is a situation where a board member applied for a job, it's their responsibility to be able to be clear with the board that they're interested in stepping away for this reason. So this is where you want to make sure that there is transparency. I'm not quite sure how, or whether the issue is that the person was, even if they were headhunted, I mean, regardless of how this board member is now transitioning to become a key role player, whether it's executive director or whatever the role is in the organization. There isn't necessarily anything hindering you from doing that, but I think it's important that you're transparent in that process, and because you can resign from a board. A board isn't it shouldn't be a lifelong thing. So you can actually step away, step down and say, I would like, I'm pursuing this other side of it. And then also recognizing that once you've done that complete step away and you do get that job within the organization, that it's important that you do not use the advantage that you have for having been a board member or having been privy to some certain type of informations, right? Because hopefully you signed a conflict of interest, you signed so many codes of ethics that kind of bind you from doing some things that you shouldn't I mean, it's difficult. I mean, the organizations, it very well in a way. Actually, it's a good thing, but there needs to be clarity and transparency in the process, in my view, all the way. But I would not say that someone could not step away from being a board member and become a staff. If that is what they choose, just be sure that it's a transparent process and everybody understands step by step what happened and how you moved and the demarcation between the roles. And when you do complete that move, please, by all means, let go of the other side. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have two questions that are quite similar, and they're wondering about how you assess board performance. What is the standard procedure for that, and who assesses the performance?
So there is a tool that, for instance, with ASAP, we've developed to assess the board. The board assesses itself. It's actually a standard procedure for most boards, whether it be corporate organizations and or NGOs, public sector organizations. The expectation is that the board should, at least at a minimum, I think every year, assess themselves. So within this tool, there's a section for assessing the chairman, and it will look at only the areas that we've just covered, it basically, asks questions about their performance in terms of their oversight role, their leadership, the skills they're using, the communication and effectiveness of, their role. And this is done by the other board members. And then the chairperson also will have board evaluation tools for each of the individual directors also assess each other. So there will be one for Petronella as the HR board director, and Abel, and then they also comment on all elements in terms of, their engagement as a board member. It looks at sections on strategy. It looks on the way they're handling, in terms of communication. So basically, their skill set. And then there is a section also where they then look at how they are functioning as a board. And there'll be questions like, dealing with performance management of the executive leadership, the regular meetings, and looking at all those areas that actually makes them a fully functioning board, including the effectiveness of their committees. And then once that is collated, they can have a report, they openly discuss that and look at where the improvement action plans are. I'm hoping that this answers the question.
All right, sounds good. So the next one is actually, can you describe a little bit about your experience in managing when there is a disconnect between the executive body and the board? How do you go about managing that?
Okay, so let me take the first stab and then yeah, that's it's a tricky one. But it's, it takes you back to the basics. It takes you back to, let's go back to, the what we've agreed, what do the policies say? What are the roles and the responsibilities of each party? And being professionals. One of the things that I've seen from my experience is that a lot of those kind of disconnects usually have an undertone around some personality challenges. So it's important, first of all, to understand what is going on, because what is really going on would help me as an external person coming to support the board to understand the situation and the full picture and be able to provide the right and adequate guidance around this. But I think depending on if the challenge is between, usually there's a personality thing, and usually there is, you might even be in the space of, oh, I'm the executive director, I recruited you, or I hired you, or I'm the founder of this organization, I brought you here, so my expectation is that you do what I want you to do. Or it could be the flip side of where the board just doesn't know what they're supposed to do and thinks that by the virtue of the fact that they're members of the board, they have now all of a sudden gotten rights to do some things that are not ethical. Again, it's about, as a board, in terms of looking at those qualities, right, again, of a good board, right? Did we orient this person well when they came? How were they recruited? Did we orient them well? Do they understand the clarity around their roles and responsibilities? What roles and what responsibilities is this situation infringing on right now? And so we can address it. And then what is the problem? What's causing because this question is tricky in the sense that I almost need to hear more. What is that situation for me to be able to provide specific response to, because it depends. But if you have gone around and ensured that all the qualities that you need to have in place for an effective board are there, and you've gone through those different processes, then it's easier for you to then figure out if it's a personality thing. And in the context of also assessing the board, there is also so many organizations out there have so many different tools also for board governance and supporting, leadership and assessing leadership. And a lot of them also have an opportunity for the organization to provide some sort of 360 version of input into the process of performance assessment. So it's a tricky question, because I feel like I need to know more to be able to provide more concrete answer.
Yeah, if I may jump in here, all that Belly's just said pretty on top. What does the disconnect look like? I think it's where clearly, the board chair and the executive leadership are not working together. So usually some of that, adding to what Belly's just said, lack of information. So there's not always openness about the true reality in the organization. And if there's a disconnect around that, that's really a big issue, because you may well be surprised as a board that actually there's some information that's been held that should be really shared. Where they don't trust each other, there's avoidance and only meet at board meetings, and then the next 3 months they're not connecting, because really in between, I think the chair and the executive normally have links. There may be special meetings for agenda items that may come that are important, and that that when there is that connection, you find that actually there's no disconnection. And then there's also, if you looked at that list of my dysfunctions, usually the disconnect happens as well when there's inattention to results and what we're about as an organization. So they don't talk. They don't really discuss many issues except whatever is on the agenda, which is really probably summaries, as opposed to actually delving into some of the key high level, what I call big head, audacious goals for the organization, in that they are always be on the same page, the chair, the board members working together. And we've had some good examples, by the way, of some of our local partners who've actually said to us, actually what we're doing now is we've got a special corner where our boards, there's a table in the organization. So they come in for special committee meetings, but also we get to see them, they engage with us. So those are good examples of where, if there's a disconnect, you don't see them until the next meeting, just a day before maybe. So you don't really get to see how are they seeing and, looking down at the organization and keeping up with what's going on. So the disconnect is always that they're not talking together, the information is limited, and the dynamics are such that, the relationship is not one of cheering each other on, but it's more, big brother is watching you.
Excellent, thank you. You had mentioned a little bit about founders syndrome, but we have had a couple of questions wondering about recommendations for how to handle it.
Yeah, so I'm gonna attempt. It's a tough one. It's a tough one that, in my experience, needs to be handled in a delicate way. Because if you go back to the genesis, really, the roots of the foundations of local organizations, right? A lot of times local organizations are formed because somebody has great passion about a particular issue, and that passion just blossoms, and over time they then, it morphs into an organization, and they begin, they begin small and they grow. So if I were that person who had that passion, it's delicate. When I get to this point, when I begin to think about board, and I begin to think, actually, to be honest, I believe in most countries, you should not be able to register an organization without having a governing body to that organization. I mean, the challenge and the question usually is whether the regulatory bodies within the country necessarily take into account how you recruited the board whether it's an advisory board or is a board of directors, is a board of trustees, whether you actually, because they don't necessarily look into that, you can really get away with a lot of things. But back to the idea of the founder syndrome, it does require clear walkthrough of the roles and the responsibilities, and clear understanding, and giving opportunity also and time to the person with this founder syndrome, recognizing that they've come a long way with babying this organization to have brought it to this point, and at the same time supporting them to be clear that there are demarcations and that there are responsibilities that are not theirs, while there are responsibilities that are that of the board. And usually you do require a third party to come in and help to facilitate this process. Usually also it's not a question of you have one board meeting and it's all sorted. It usually takes some time for them to let go. But again, anyone who's the passionate founder of an organization, I would want to believe that your interest and your desire is that which that organization exists to do, for which you have the passion, you want it to be sustainable. You're thinking long-term. You're thinking that you continue to provide the services to the constituency over time. Therefore, you should actually, more than anyone else, be interested in instituting the right bodies to guide you on the way to get to this level of sustainability. So, like I said, again, it would require a delicate but very, very possible process. It has, loads of organizations have worked with it, and finally, actually, when those who have these syndromes actually finally remove themselves from the situation, they actually feel a little more relieved that the burden is no longer all on them. And they don't really necessarily see it as that way at that point. They usually see it as in someone's trying to take away their baby. So I think it requires a lot of understanding, recognizing that, what comes with this, and being patient and delicate, and having an outlined process of how this is going to happen, so that both the founder and the board are very clear. And if also the founder has recruited a great board with diverse technical skills, they should also appreciate that and want that technical group to be able to come together and move the organization forward. Because why are you even looking for a governing body, right? You want to make sure that this organization is moving forward. I don't know if Petronella has more to add.
Yeah, that sounded perfect.
Excellent, thank you. So we have some questions about best practices for recruiting board members, and then also how to keep them engaged.
I think best practices for recruiting members is, well, first of all, the board itself has got to do a quick analysis of what skill set they need in the for the board, to help with the organization, based obviously on the strategic plan or the the roadmap that the organization has. And then they start to look at that skill set, and on this matrix that we usually share with the board is where the current board would set out, they write out who they are, and then they start thinking, okay, have we got somebody good enough, to assist us with risk management, for instance, or audit, and or HR or any of those areas. And then the idea is that then the executive leadership usually takes a role in actually assisting in the recruitment of the right level of board members. And usually I think my experience is that these recommended people, they headhunt very much from their connections, and then, but once they do that, there's still a formal process of taking them through and engaging with them to ascertain themselves that actually we've got the right level of person on board, and then of course move on to recruiting them. I don't know if you want to add on, Abel.
The only thing I just want to add is don't forget to have a job description. A board member is a position. And I think one of the key things that we usually fall prey to is that we just, we discuss and we have it written out, have it well, like this is the skill we're looking to add to what we have to move us forward, right? So even if you are now taking that description and head hunting with it, at least you're from the get-go sharing with somebody who's coming into that position. This is what we are looking for, and this is what we need you to be able to do, to support, to augment, to contribute to this team that already exists. This is what we are missing. So just to add, because I think that a lot of times we forget that idea of documenting exactly what we are looking for in that role. And so everyone comes onto the board, all of us, we're all just there. Nobody actually necessarily knows where. We're hoping that when we have a conversation, somebody would divide up. No, there has to be a need and there has to be a description of what we're looking for before you come in, so that way it also kind of helps us to quickly get aligned in terms of what it is we are doing as a board.
And then I guess to add on to say, then once you've recruited them, then having that whole system of supporting them, inducting them in the program, but also what I call hand-holding, that the board chair hopefully is it's got a support system in place for those members to then once they've come in, because you're now coming into a dynamics where there's some existing members and there's the new board members, and what events can we have to just engage and bring everybody together for cohesion, I think.
Perfect, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes left and we're going to continue answering questions, but just to let everybody know, we're going to launch the poll right now. So you'll have until the end of the webinar to fill it out, just so it's going to pop up on your screen. All right, so next question. One of our local partners has noticed that some of the NGOs in their area have been using advertising to recruit board members. Is this considered a good practice? And if so, why or why not?
It is considered a great practice. It's the practice you want to actually do, so that when I see it and I apply and I come in and I see my role and I see my responsibilities, I am very clear what I signed up for. I have looked at my particular situation and my day job and known that I can also accommodate, or I can also serve, because to be honest, the role of being in a board is a role of complete service. And I've also chosen to serve in this. So actually that is that's the first. So you put together what it is you want and then you advertise. So, but I'm saying even in that advertisement, it could mean sending it directly to specific people that that could fit that role and that you're interested in recruiting. That's the best way actually to recruit board membership.
Excellent, thank you. In your experience, do you find that cultural differences are one of the major challenges in developing a local partner board and in local partner board management? And if so, how do you deal with it?
I think cultural differences can never be avoided depending on who is. I know certainly some of the NGOs we work with, their work is expansive, so they tap in members from different backgrounds, and what they bring in together that already into the board means that the way of doing things, cultural differences in terms of behavior and what is expected of individuals may play a role, but I think it talks to the leadership from my perspective, that it's again the board chair and some of the existing members setting the tone and ensuring that when it comes to deliberation on the issues, the agenda, the board work, governing their role, then it should be still as a level playing field. And I don't know that makes sense here.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those questions that I would like to get a little bit more information. I've worked with local partners, I have worked for local organizations as a staff myself. And I've also worked with local organizations as a staff of an NGO, supporting local partners and local capacity for quite a while now. And I've done that across quite a number of countries. So I'm not sure whether this question is saying, you know, if I'm in country X, could I say that, you know, a board is functioning better because it's that country, or better than, or are we talking about if I'm in country X and I'm saying that I have external? So this is one of those questions that does definitely require some more explanation so that I can better answer it. But nonetheless, cultural differences can never be avoided. And as Petronella just shared, I think that something else to bear in mind again is that we always must have that compass of the clear, articulated what it is, who we are, policies, procedures, bylaws that guide us, so that regardless of the cultural difference or the culture you come from, there is, you know, in this, to be honest, the board itself should begin to form its own culture as the board of that organization, so that this, remember, we're talking about the three duties, the three fundamental fiduciary duties that you as a board member owes to the organization, right? And we talked about the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And technically speaking, that's a place where you want to make sure that you are putting the organization and the organization's interest above any other things that are. So but like I said, I think that question, I would need to understand whether, you know, we're saying a board member in Asia versus a board member in Africa, or is it in Europe? But thank you, Susan.
Thank you. All right, next question. We've had a couple of questions around conflict of interest. So what are some of the best practices for handling conflict of interest involving board members?
Sorry, Susan, can you repeat that? I think you were dropping there.
Oh, my apologies. So the question is about conflict of interest. What are some of the best practices for handling conflicts of interest among board members?
So my experience with this is that within the board, there's a toolkit that, you know, I know Abel was just talking about that, you know, the charter, the code of conduct, and one of the key ones, you know, policies in terms of a, you know, form that says conflict of interest declaration form is one of those that I certainly have had people use, where, you know, individuals, you know, the board members have to fill in and complete regularly, in terms of, you know, some people say once a year, but at each board meeting, there's an item there that says, welcome, the agenda, and then any conflict of interest, and the board chair, you know, depending on the agenda is on that day, people have got to either, you know, excuse themselves if there are issues that they may come up that, you know, they need to declare. And usually there's a form, you know, my experience is in certain countries, they actually sign a form there and then as well, which is kept by the legal or you know, their secretariat person. And there is a folder that's kept on. So it's looking at a 1 yearly proper declaration form, which actually outlines, and they sign, and or some board chairs who every meeting they often check just verbally, and that is also recorded on the minutes. That's the experience I'm aware of. I don't know any other examples there.
No, those all sounds great, Petronella. I think, you know, from the other general perspective, I would say, call it out. It's a conflict. It's a conflict, and I've had to work with some boards where the truth is that the problem was more of the fact that people were not willing to call it out for what it is. than, because everybody, you know, people didn't want to be the one who was saying that it's the organization. And especially in our world, right, where we're, you know, like I said, the funding is not that much, and then you are part of this board, and then you know, there's funding usually, not usually, but in this case, there was funding involved, and there was also another organization that you were running, right? So you already signed some things for the as a member of this board, and you know that I mean, some boards provide that opportunity for recusal, so you can recuse yourself, and in the process, when a matter that concerns you is, or concerns, you know, you are in direct relationship with, is being deliberated. But I think that what is, for that to happen also, you need to call it out. You cannot afford to be a board member sitting down there and essentially taking information and feeding the people who, potentially, who may be competing for something, because that's in a lot of ways, whether it's a contract, right? Maybe it's just an organization who's sending out a contract for the purchase of cars or something, right? But you know, a dealership, right? And then you want to, so that is conflict of interest. And you need to be able to call such things out. And if and I know that sometimes it's about our relatives who are on the other side saying, oh, but you're a board member, you can make this happen. But you need to realize that you are bound by certain ethical standards, which you need to be able to think about the organization. Again, think about the organization that you are serving, and not self. Remove self from the process. And be transparent. I just wanted to make sure that I said that, you know, call it out. Don't spend time trying to understand or trying to figure it. Just call it out. And also feel free to tell people that I'm a member of that board. I cannot be in this process with you, or engage in this way, or share information in this way, because I am bound by these ethics.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a couple of questions about financial incentives and board members. So one of them is an incentive package a common practice in motivating volunteer board members supporting local organizations? And the other question was about a sitting allowance, whether or not that's a common practice, and what to do if management does not agree with providing that.
Okay, I'll take a first stab at this one, and then Petronella can tell us what she's doing with that situation with under the project. So I've seen this so many times, right? Because it is what it is, right? So I'm almost even wondering whether I want to let Petronella maybe share first, so that we're talking about the real life examples before I sort of provide. And I think maybe let me do that, because I think it's better that way. Petronella, please share first.
That's what you call passing the back. It's a very emotional one, this one, whereby as a board, as an organization, you are inviting people to come and support you on this big project. And then, you know, yes, I might be volunteering, but what is there in terms of giving me a sense of belonging and maybe some support? I've seen, you know, board members who are given sitting allowance, not a lot, but enough, you know, after each board meeting, and or if they've attended any events that, you know, that takes up any of their time. Let's assume there's been a retrenchment program, they spent a day or two in there, they you know, there is that. So, and usually in the board charter and or constitution, there is a section in there, I think, in terms of, you know, remuneration of board directors. Okay, it's much more private sector, but I've seen it in some of in our NGOs, where, you know, again, there's an agreement through the board, what, you know, that they will be given something. It's not a practice that every board does, but it also motivates the board. That's my personal thinking. They, you know, they get that sense of belonging, and you're appreciating their time, and usually it can be quite busy. depending on what that, the board member, role is within the organization. So I'm erring on what I've seen, the good practices have been there, at least acknowledged, and it's formalized and it's understood, not expecting a lot, but it's just an appreciation, and it's a formalized one in the organization. And that's
yeah, no, and that's kind of like why I wanted you to maybe share first instead of me jumping onto it. But it's important to note, right, that it is a non-profit board.
Yeah.
Right. So it's important that that we are all reminded that it's a service.
Yeah.
So technically, for the non-profit board, you don't really get a lot of non-profit boards that are being paid anything. If you're talking about a for-profit organization, of course, I mean, they make profit, right? So they do actually pay sitting allowance to their board members. In the non-profit world, they would probably make sure that you have a venue to meet, take care of those kind of costs, but you can't charge because of the nature of the nonprofit organizations where you are soliciting for funding to do the work you do. You cannot talk about sitting allowance as a line item in your budget to a donor around the work that you do. So it's important that you recognize that if somebody is coming in, and that's why, again, I said that advertising in the recruitment process is very critical, because then the person knows that there is no funding, there's no money, unless if we had, unrestricted funding that we wanted to utilize for this process. It doesn't mean that you can't take them to, a good venue, make sure that you feed them while they're doing the meeting, or even keep them in a place while they're doing the meeting. But the idea of sitting allowance, it's not, I know that, we talk about sitting allowance not being a salary, sitting allowance. Well, to be honest, if the organization, the institution can actually afford it outside of donor funding, I mean, by all means, it's great, like Petronella said, to appreciate. But I would not recommend, to be honest, that I would be advertising that I'm giving sitting allowance or paying board members in the nonprofits, especially with local organizations as we are set up. And I know it's a tough thing to hear. I think that's why I wanted Petronella to go first, because it's tough, but that is the reality. It's not, there's no other, you already, it's not probably going to be allowed by a number of donors, though. Again, and it also just depends, right? We also have faith-based organizations who completely run under a very different structure. So and they have different funding availabilities and sources as well. So there is that. So I think it also just depends on the type of organization. But I would as a leader of a nonprofit, I would not be thinking about setting out some sort of payments or allowances, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you. So we just have a few minutes left, so we're just going to have one more question. But for all the questions that weren't answered, these wonderful presenters are going to answer them in a document that we're going to put together, and it'll be available on the IntraHealth ASAP website in about a week. So all of your questions will be answered, and we'll send you out a link to that document when it's created. So for the final question, and it's not an easy one, I know, but what is the average size or expected size of a board? What is most appropriate, most efficient? I'm sure this depends a lot on the size of the NGO, but just wanted to throw that one out there for you.
I'm sure both of us will be able to jump in. We'll probably, we will differ slightly there. It depends on the size of the organization, obviously. But, and of course, if you remember my slide that says that you've got to have, the board has got to have enough visibility of the within the organization. So when when you are setting up a board, it's very important to consider that. the size of the organization, and then decide on a board number. Normally, my experience is we're talking from 7 to 11, and usually it's an uneven number, so it allows for voting on key issues. Because if you have a even number, it can be a real issue. Over to you, Eben.
No. I mean, you've offered what I would have offered. I mean, the number differs. This is 5. I think what's critical is that it needs to be that odd number so that you can break ties around voting. That's what's most critical. And also, just be aware that if there are too many people in the board, it becomes unwieldy. And then and then they're not able. I mean, think about it. If there are too many people, decisions become a little bit more difficult, right? So that's something you want to think about. And at the same time, if there are too few, you also may not necessarily get that array of technical expertise and contributions which you desire, and for which was the reason why you wanted to make sure that you had this governing body available to provide you with the guidance and the oversight and the support. So it's let's look at the organization, let's look at what our needs are, and let's look at what it is that we need to be able to do. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. And this webinar will be available in French. We're just figuring out the date of that coming up. So be sure to keep an eye on your email inboxes and we will let you know. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was really great.